Hi, everyone. We are going to talk about the new poetry module review assignment. The first thing I want you to do is go up to the share settings in the right-hand corner, click it, and make sure that your share settings are set to services.live. If it's set to anything other than services.live, we need to change it. Make sure it's on services.live and click done. This ensures that your teachers can view your assignments. So let's talk about this module review. This is a review of the new poetry module. So we read a quite wide variety of different poetry forms in this module. So we're going to talk about some of the major concepts that were discussed throughout the module. This will help you on the exam. Let's look at number one. In your own words, what was a common theme found in poetry during the first half of the century? So, themes can still be found in poetry. That's not something that's exclusive to, say, a short story or a novel. Poetry also contains themes. And remember, themes are the life lessons or the morals of that story. Think about the conflicts that were discussed in that poem. How did the narrator or the society, the individual that the poem is focusing on, how did they overcome that conflict? Now, we're really focusing more in this question on the historical context of poetry. So there really is one kind of major historical theme that's happening in America during this time in history. So a lot of these poets are writing about kind of the same problems that are happening in society or the same ideals or visions for what they have in America. So that's really what your theme is going to be for this question is what was the major issue or change that these poets in America during this time were seeking? Number two says identify and describe three poetic forms referenced in this module. And for each form, provide an example of a poet from this module who used it. So this is a two-part question. The first part, you're going to identify and describe three poetic forms that were referenced in the module. Remember, poetic forms are really just the structure of the poem. So as simple as they come can be like a haiku, or it can be a limerick or soliloquy. Now, those aren't necessarily mentioned and discussed in this module, but as you're working through this module, you'll see several different poetic forms referenced. So you'll need to identify them and describe them. Just give me a brief definition of what that poetic form looks like. Like, for example, if we said haiku, we would say that it has 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and 5 syllables in the third line. Now, the second part of this question, for each of these forms that you've identified in the first part, you need to provide an example of a poet from the module who used it. So it is really, really important that you make sure that the poetic form you've identified and the poet that you've identified who uses that form are both from this module. Now, number three, the last question here. How did the regional modernists portray their respective parts of the country? Provide at least one example of a poet from this module who incorporated regionalism in their poetry. So remember, we just talked about regionalism in our last module, the Beyond Realism module, and regionalism really is this kind of insider look into what life looks like in rural America. It's typically going to be set in a small town. There's going to be some really strong sense of community and locale. Characters are typically going to be very simple and relatable. Those are typical traits of regionalism. So kind of think about that and think about how that's represented in different poems and how those different poets discussed or used regionalism in their poetry. How did they portray their specific parts or regions of the country? And then all you're going to need to do for the second part of this is just provide one example of a poem from the module who used regionalism in their poetry. It can be any poet you want. You can kind of combine your two-part answer into one for this question, and just state who that poet was from the module and how they portrayed their region of this country.